Welcome to Untold Stories of Freddie Mercury. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The crisp mountain air of Montreux carried an unusual tension that autumn day in 1981. Inside Mountain Studios, nestled along the pristine shores of Lake Geneva, two of rock's most enigmatic figures found themselves sharing the same creative space for the first time. The studio, which had become Queen's sanctuary, away from the chaos of London, suddenly felt smaller, charged with an electric anticipation that even the seasoned engineers could sense. Freddie Mercury arrived first that morning, his usual theatrical entrance subdued by an uncharacteristic nervousness. He had worked with countless artists before, but this collaboration felt different. David Bowie wasn't just another musician seeking to capture some of Queen's magic. He was an equal, a shapeshifter who had reinvented himself as many times as Freddie had reinvented rock opera. The Persian-born frontman adjusted his mustache in the studio's reflection, a small gesture that betrayed the magnitude of what lay ahead. When Bowie finally walked through those studio doors, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Dressed in his characteristic understated elegance, the thin white Duke carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already conquered every musical frontier imaginable. His heterochromatic eyes surveyed the familiar Queen setup, the grand piano where countless anthems had been born, the microphones that had captured Freddie's most soaring vocals, the very walls that seemed to pulse with the band's creative energy. The initial pleasantries were polite, almost formal. Both men understood they were entering uncharted territory. This wasn't a typical collaboration where one artist featured on another's track. This was a meeting of equals, two forces of nature attempting to create something neither could achieve alone. The weight of their combined legacies hung in the air like incense, heavy and intoxicating. Roger Taylor and John Deacon exchanged glances from behind their instruments, sensing the delicate dance beginning between their front man and the legendary Bowie. Brian May, ever the diplomat, attempted to ease the tension with technical discussions about guitar arrangements, but even his gentle nature couldn't fully dissolve the creative electricity crackling between the two icons. What made this moment historically significant wasn't just the meeting of two superstars, it was the collision of two completely different approaches to artistry. Freddie operated on pure instinct and emotion, his creativity flowing like molten lava, unpredictable and magnificent. Bowie, meanwhile, was the master craftsman, methodical in his madness, calculating even in his most experimental moments. Their creative processes were as different as fire and ice, yet both had the power to transform everything they touched. The studio session had been arranged almost casually, a spontaneous decision born from mutual respect and curiosity. Queen had been working on new material, and when Bowie expressed interest in collaborating, the invitation was extended without hesitation. But now, faced with the reality of merging their distinct artistic visions, both men realized they were about to embark on something far more complex than either had anticipated. As the afternoon light filtered through the studio windows, casting long shadows across the mixing board, an unspoken challenge began to emerge. It wasn't born from rivalry or competition, but from the deeper recognition that true artistic greatness only emerged when pushed beyond comfortable boundaries. Neither Freddie nor Bowie had achieved their legendary status by playing it safe, and this collaboration would demand nothing less than complete creative vulnerability from both. The stage was set for a musical confrontation that would test not only their individual talents, but their ability to surrender their egos for the sake of something greater. History was about to be made, but first, these two titans would have to find a way to share the same creative space without destroying each other in the process. The tension in Mountain Studios reached its peak when the first musical ideas began to surface. What started as polite creative exploration quickly transformed into something far more intense, a silent battle of artistic philosophies that would define the entire collaboration. Freddie positioned himself at the grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys with the fluid grace that had made him a legend, while Bowie stood nearby, absorbing every note with the analytical precision of a master strategist. The initial jam session revealed the fundamental differences in their approaches immediately. Freddie's playing was pure emotion made audible, cascading arpeggios that seemed to emerge from his very soul. melodies that twisted and soared without warning or apology. His body moved with the music, every gesture an extension of the sound itself, as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra that only he could hear. The piano became an extension of his theatrical nature, each chord progression a small drama unto itself. Bowie, however, approached the collaboration with a different kind of intensity. He listened with the focus of a scientist studying a fascinating new phenomenon. His head tilted slightly as he processed not just the notes Freddie played, but the spaces between them, the rhythmic patterns that emerged, the emotional undertones that most musicians would miss entirely. When he finally picked up his guitar, his contribution was deliberate, calculated, yet no less powerful for its restraint. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Roger Taylor found himself adjusting his drumming style constantly, trying to bridge the gap between Freddie's explosive creativity and Bowie's more structured approach. John Deacon's bass lines became the diplomatic thread holding the two styles together, while Brian May watched the interaction with the fascination of someone witnessing a rare natural phenomenon. What emerged from those first hours wasn't chaos, but something far more intriguing, a musical conversation between two masters speaking different languages, yet somehow understanding each other perfectly. Freddie would launch into a passionate melodic phrase, and Bowie would respond with a guitar line that both complemented and challenged it. The Thin White Duke's contributions weren't attempts to match Freddie's energy, but rather to provide a counterpoint that made the Queen frontman's natural exuberance even more powerful by contrast. The real breakthrough came when Bowie made his first subtle challenge. Instead of following Freddie's lead into familiar Queen territory, he introduced a rhythmic pattern that was distinctly his own, angular, unexpected, demanding that everyone in the room reconsider their assumptions about where the music was heading. It wasn't aggressive or confrontational, but it was unmistakably a gauntlet thrown down with characteristic Bowie elegance. Freddie's response was immediate and instinctive. Rather than resist the new direction, he embraced it with the fearless enthusiasm that had always defined his artistry. His vocals began to explore territories he had never ventured into before, influenced by Bowie's more experimental sensibilities, yet remaining unmistakably his own. The challenge had awakened something in him, a desire to prove that his theatrical grandeur could adapt to any musical landscape, no matter how foreign. The studio engineers found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. These weren't two artists trying to create a typical duet or collaboration. This was a real-time evolution of both musicians, each pushing the other into unexplored creative territories. The tape machines rolled continuously, capturing not just the music, but the very process of artistic transformation happening before their eyes. As the evening progressed, the initial politeness gave way to something more honest and raw. Both men began to reveal aspects of their artistry that rarely surfaced in their individual work. Freddie's vulnerability became more apparent when filtered through Bowie's introspective lens, while Bowie's emotional depth found new expression when amplified by Freddie's dramatic sensibilities. The other Queen members realized they were no longer just backing musicians in this session. They were witnesses to a historic meeting of minds that was reshaping the very definition of what rock collaboration could be. The music emerging from their instruments was unlike anything Queen had ever recorded, yet it was also distinctly different from Bowie's solo work. Something entirely new was being born. By the time they took their first real break, the challenge had been accepted by both parties. Neither man had backed down, neither had compromised their essential artistic identity, yet both had been fundamentally changed by the encounter. The real work was just beginning, and everyone in the room knew they were about to embark on a journey that would test the very limits of creative collaboration. The second day in Mountain Studios brought with it a palpable shift in energy. The polite exploration of the previous session had given way to something more urgent, more demanding. Freddie arrived earlier than usual, his mind already racing with the musical possibilities that had kept him awake most of the night. The challenge Bowie had presented wasn't just artistic, it was personal, touching the very core of what made Freddie Mercury the performer he had become. Bowie entered the studio with his characteristic quiet confidence, but there was something different in his demeanor. The previous day's session had clearly affected him as well. The Thin White Duke, who had collaborated with everyone from John Lennon to Iggy Pop, seemed genuinely intrigued by the creative tension that had emerged. This wasn't just another collaboration for him either. It was a test of whether two such distinct artistic forces could truly merge without losing their individual essence. The breakthrough moment came unexpectedly, emerging from what seemed like a simple bass line that John Deacon had been experimenting with during the soundcheck. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost tribal in its insistence, and it immediately caught both frontmen's attention. Freddie's fingers found the piano keys instinctively, adding layers of harmony that transformed Deacon's simple pattern into something far more complex and compelling. But it was Bowie's response that truly ignited the creative fire. Instead of adding his own melodic line, he began to deconstruct what Freddie was building, taking the Queen frontman's soaring melodies and fragmenting them, creating spaces and silences that somehow made the music more powerful. It was a masterclass in artistic restraint, showing that sometimes the most profound musical statements came not from what was played, but from what was deliberately left unplayed. Freddie initially resisted this deconstruction, his natural instinct being to fill every musical space with his dramatic presence. But as the session progressed, he began to understand the genius of Bowie's approach. The spaces weren't empty. They were pregnant with possibility, allowing the listener's imagination to complete the musical picture. It was a revelation that would fundamentally change how Freddie approached his own artistry. Roger Taylor's drumming became the bridge between these two approaches, his rhythmic patterns shifting seamlessly between the driving force that Queen's music demanded and the more subtle, textured approach that Bowie's sensibilities required. Brian May found himself playing guitar parts unlike anything he had ever recorded, his usual melodic solos giving way to atmospheric textures that served the song rather than showcasing his technical prowess. The real magic happened when both men began to sing together for the first time. Their voices, so different in tone and approach, created an unexpected harmony that neither could have achieved alone. Freddie's operatic power provided the emotional foundation, while Bowie's more conversational style added layers of meaning and nuance. The combination was electrifying, creating vocal textures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. As the hours passed, the competitive edge that had initially driven their interaction began to transform into something more collaborative. They were no longer trying to outdo each other, but rather to create something that neither could accomplish individually. The challenge had evolved into a shared quest for musical perfection, with each artist pushing the other toward heights they had never reached before. The studio engineers worked frantically to capture every moment, knowing they were witnessing something historic. The tape machines rolled continuously, preserving not just the final takes but the entire creative process, the false starts, the sudden inspirations, the moments of doubt and breakthrough that would later be studied by musicians and producers around the world. By the end of that session, something fundamental had shifted. The challenge had been met and exceeded, transforming into a collaboration that would redefine what was possible when two musical giants truly trusted each other enough to be vulnerable in their artistry. The third day at Mountain Studios marked a turning point that would echo through rock history for decades to come. The competitive tension that had initially defined the collaboration between Freddie Mercury and David Bowie had transformed into something far more profound, a creative symbiosis that neither artist had experienced before. The studio, which had witnessed countless Queen masterpieces, now hummed with an entirely different energy, as if the very walls were absorbing the magic being created within them. Freddie's approach to the piano had evolved dramatically since that first tentative session. Gone was the need to dominate every musical moment with his characteristic grandeur. Instead, he had learned to listen, truly listen to the spaces that Bowie created, understanding that sometimes the most powerful musical statements emerged from restraint rather than excess. His fingers moved across the keys with a newfound sensitivity, each note carefully chosen to complement rather than compete with his collaborators' contributions. The bass line that had sparked their breakthrough continued to evolve, becoming the foundation upon which their entire creative edifice was being built. John Deacon's rhythmic pattern had taken on a life of its own, growing more complex and hypnotic with each iteration. What had started as a simple musical phrase was now the heartbeat of something unprecedented, a song that belonged neither to Queen nor to Bowie's solo catalogue, but existed in a unique creative space that only their collaboration could have produced. Bowie's guitar work during this session revealed layers of his artistry that even his most devoted fans had rarely witnessed. His playing was becoming increasingly atmospheric, creating sonic landscapes that seemed to shift and breathe with organic life. Each chord progression was a carefully constructed emotional journey, designed not to showcase technical prowess, but to serve the greater musical narrative they were weaving together. His approach was surgical in its precision, yet deeply emotional in its impact. The vocal arrangements that emerged during this period were nothing short of revolutionary. Freddie's natural tendency toward operatic drama found perfect counterpoint in Bowie's more conversational, almost spoken-word approach. Their voices began to intertwine in ways that defied conventional harmony, creating textures that seemed to exist in multiple emotional dimensions simultaneously. When Freddie soared into his upper register, Bowie would ground the performance with earthy, intimate tones that made the Queen frontman's flights of fancy feel more human and accessible. Roger Taylor and Brian May found themselves adapting their playing styles in real time, becoming musical chameleons who could shift between Queen's anthemic approach and Bowie's more experimental sensibilities within the same song. Taylor's drumming became increasingly nuanced, incorporating elements of funk and art rock that had never appeared in Queen's music before. May's guitar work evolved beyond his signature sound, embracing textures and tones that served the collaborative vision rather than his individual musical identity. The recording process itself had become a form of performance art. The studio engineers worked with the intensity of surgeons, knowing that they were capturing lightning in a bottle. Every take was precious, every musical moment potentially historic. The tape machines rolled continuously, preserving not just the final performances, but the entire creative evolution, the moments of discovery, the sudden inspirations, the gradual refinement of ideas that would eventually coalesce into something timeless. What made this session particularly remarkable was the complete absence of ego-driven decision-making. Both Freddie and Bowie had reached a point where the song itself had become more important than individual recognition or artistic dominance. They were serving something larger than themselves, channeling their combined talents toward a creative goal that neither could have achieved alone. The competitive challenge that had initiated their collaboration had evolved into a shared quest for musical transcendence. As the evening light faded over Lake Geneva, the studio was filled with an almost sacred atmosphere. The music they were creating felt destined for immortality, carrying within it the DNA of two of rock's most innovative artists, while simultaneously transcending both of their individual legacies. The challenge had been met, exceeded, and transformed into something that would influence generations of musicians yet to come. The foundation was now complete. What remained was the delicate process of bringing their creation to its final, perfect form. The fourth day at Mountain Studios would later be remembered as the moment when musical history crystallized into its final form. The atmosphere in the studio had reached an almost mystical intensity, with every person present understanding that they were witnessing the birth of something truly extraordinary. The song that had emerged from the creative collision between Freddie Mercury and David Bowie was no longer just a collaboration. It had become a living entity with its own gravitational pull, demanding perfection from everyone involved. Freddie arrived that morning with an unusual serenity about him. The frantic energy that typically characterized his studio sessions had been replaced by a focused calm that spoke to the profound transformation he had undergone during this collaboration. His relationship with the piano had evolved into something almost telepathic, his fingers finding melodies that seemed to emerge from the instrument itself rather than from conscious thought. The competitive fire that had initially driven him had been refined into pure artistic purpose. Bowie's presence in the studio had also shifted dramatically. The calculated coolness that was his trademark had given way to something more vulnerable and immediate. His guitar work had become increasingly intuitive, responding to Freddie's musical phrases with an almost supernatural sensitivity. The Thin White Duke was allowing himself to be genuinely surprised by the creative process, embracing the unpredictability that came with true artistic collaboration. The breakthrough moment came when they began working on what would become the song's most iconic element, the bass line that would make John Deacon's contribution legendary. The pattern that had started as a simple rhythmic foundation had evolved into something hypnotic and irresistible, a musical hook that seemed to burrow directly into the listener's consciousness. Deacon's playing had reached a level of groove and precision that elevated the entire composition, providing the perfect platform for both frontmen to showcase their evolved artistry. Roger Taylor's drumming during this session was a masterclass in musical restraint and power. His rhythmic patterns had become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating elements that served the song's unique character while maintaining the driving force that made it undeniably compelling. Every fill, every accent, every subtle shift in dynamics was calculated to enhance the overall musical narrative without drawing attention to itself. His contribution was becoming the invisible foundation that allowed the more obvious elements to shine. Brian May's guitar work reached new heights of creativity as he found ways to complement both Bowie's atmospheric textures and Freddie's melodic sensibilities. His signature sound was still present, but it had been filtered through the collaborative process, emerging as something both familiar and completely new. His solos were no longer showcases of technical ability, but integral parts of the song's emotional architecture, each note serving the greater musical purpose. The vocal arrangements that emerged during this session would later be studied by musicians and producers around the world. Freddie and Bowie had discovered a way to blend their distinctly different styles into something that enhanced both while creating an entirely new vocal texture. Their voices moved in and out of harmony with an organic fluidity that seemed effortless, but was actually the result of countless hours of careful refinement and mutual understanding. The recording process itself had become a form of meditation, with everyone in the studio completely absorbed in the pursuit of musical perfection. The engineers worked with the precision of master craftsmen, capturing every nuance of the performance while remaining invisible to the creative process. The tape machines preserved not just the final takes, but the entire journey of discovery that had led to this moment of crystallization. As the session progressed, it became clear that they were no longer working on a song. They were midwifing the birth of a classic. The music had taken on a life of its own, demanding nothing less than complete commitment from everyone involved. The challenge that had brought Freddie and Bowie together had evolved into something far more significant: the creation of a piece of art that would outlive them both. The final elements were falling into place, and everyone present could feel the approaching moment when their creation would be complete, ready to take its place among the greatest collaborations in rock history. The fifth day at Mountain Studios brought with it an unexpected weight that settled over the entire creative team like a heavy blanket. The song that had emerged from the collaboration between Freddie Mercury and David Bowie was nearing completion. But with that proximity to perfection came an almost paralyzing awareness of its potential impact. Everyone in the studio could feel the magnitude of what they were creating, and that knowledge brought both exhilaration and an intense pressure to get every detail absolutely right. Freddie found himself experiencing a form of creative anxiety he had rarely encountered before. His usual confidence in the studio had been tempered by the realization that this wasn't just another Queen track. This was something that would define both his legacy and Bowie's for generations to come. Every vocal take carried the weight of history. Every melodic choice felt monumentally significant. The Persian-born frontman, who had built his career on fearless artistic expression, was now grappling with the responsibility of perfection. Bowie, meanwhile, was experiencing his own internal struggle with the approaching completion of their masterpiece. The Thin White Duke had always been a perfectionist, but this collaboration had pushed him into uncharted emotional territory. His guitar parts, which had evolved from calculated contributions to deeply personal expressions, now required a level of vulnerability that challenged his carefully constructed artistic persona. Each take demanded that he strip away another layer of protective coolness. The technical aspects of the recording had become increasingly complex as they refined every element of the song. The bass line that John Deacon had crafted was now being layered with additional textures and harmonics that enhanced its hypnotic power. Every note was scrutinized, every rhythmic accent adjusted with microscopic precision. The simple pattern that had sparked their initial breakthrough had evolved into a sophisticated musical foundation that could support the weight of both artists' combined genius. Roger Taylor's drumming had reached a level of nuanced perfection that surprised even his bandmates. His rhythmic patterns had become so integral to the song's character that removing even a single accent would have fundamentally altered its impact. The pressure to maintain this level of precision while preserving the organic feel that made the track so compelling was immense, requiring a delicate balance between technical mastery and emotional authenticity. Brian May's guitar work was undergoing its final refinements, with each overdub adding layers of complexity that served the song's emotional narrative. His contributions had become so seamlessly integrated with Bowie's that it was often impossible to distinguish where one artist's work ended and the other's began. This musical fusion represented the ultimate success of their collaboration, but it also meant that every note carried exponential importance. The studio engineers worked with the intensity of master surgeons, knowing that their technical decisions would be preserved for eternity. Every microphone placement, every mixing choice, every subtle adjustment to the sound had to serve the greater artistic vision while maintaining the raw power that made the performance so compelling. The pressure to capture the magic without destroying it through overproduction was constant and exhausting. As the day progressed, the weight of creating something timeless began to affect everyone differently. Some thrived under the pressure, finding inspiration in the knowledge that they were crafting a piece of musical history. Others struggled with the responsibility, second-guessing decisions that had felt natural just days before. The song was nearly complete, but the final steps toward perfection would prove to be the most challenging of all. The sixth day at Mountain Studios dawned with an electric anticipation that seemed to charge the very air around Lake Geneva. This would be the day when everything they had built over the previous sessions would either crystallize into perfection or crumble under the weight of their own expectations. Freddie Mercury and David Bowie both understood that they stood at the precipice of creating something truly immortal, but first they had to navigate the treacherous final steps that separated good music from greatness. The morning session began with an almost ceremonial quality, as if everyone present recognized the historical significance of what was about to unfold. Freddie approached the piano with a reverence that was unusual for him, his fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before beginning to play. The melody that emerged was the culmination of everything they had discovered together, a perfect synthesis of his operatic grandeur and Bowie's experimental sophistication. Bowie's response was immediate and instinctive, his guitar joining Freddie's piano in a musical conversation that had evolved far beyond their initial competitive dynamic. The Thin White Duke had found a way to channel his artistic restlessness into something focused and purposeful, creating guitar textures that enhanced rather than competed with Freddie's melodic vision. Their musical dialogue had become so refined that they seemed to anticipate each other's creative choices before they were made. The breakthrough moment came when they began working on the song's climactic section, the part that would either elevate their creation to legendary status or expose the limitations of their collaboration. John Deacon's bass line, which had been the foundation of everything they had built, suddenly locked into a groove so perfect and hypnotic that it seemed to pull the entire universe into its rhythmic orbit. The pattern was simple, yet infinitely complex, accessible yet sophisticated, commercial yet artistic. Roger Taylor's drumming during this crucial passage reached a level of inspired precision that would later be studied by musicians around the world. His rhythmic choices were simultaneously powerful and subtle, driving the song forward while creating space for the melodic elements to breathe and develop. Every accent, every fill, every dynamic shift served the greater musical narrative with surgical precision. Brian May's guitar work provided the final piece of the puzzle, weaving melodic lines that connected Freddie's vocal passages with Bowie's atmospheric contributions. His playing had evolved beyond his signature style into something that belonged uniquely to this collaboration, creating textures that were both familiar and completely revolutionary. The vocal arrangements that emerged during this session would become the stuff of legend. Freddie and Bowie had discovered a way to blend their voices that created something greater than the sum of its parts. Their harmonies were unconventional yet perfect, challenging yet accessible, creating emotional depths that neither artist could have achieved alone. As the final takes were recorded, everyone in the studio could feel the moment when their creation transcended the realm of mere music and entered the territory of art. The song had found its final form, and that form was undeniably perfect. The challenge that had brought these two titans together had resulted in something that would outlive them both, influencing generations of musicians and touching millions of lives around the world. The pressure that had built over the previous days suddenly lifted, replaced by a profound sense of accomplishment and wonder. They had done it. They had created something truly timeless. The final day at Mountain Studios carried with it a bittersweet atmosphere that none of the participants would ever forget. As the last notes of their masterpiece echoed through the control room, Freddie Mercury and David Bowie sat in contemplative silence, both understanding that they had just completed something that would define their legacies for generations to come. The song that would become known as Under Pressure was complete, but its journey into immortality was just beginning. The mixing process that followed was conducted with the reverence of master craftsmen, putting the finishing touches on a priceless work of art. Every frequency was carefully balanced, every dynamic nuance preserved with meticulous attention to detail. The engineers worked with the knowledge that their technical decisions would be scrutinized by millions of listeners for decades to come, each adjustment carrying the weight of musical history. Freddie's transformation during this collaboration had been profound and lasting. The competitive fire that had initially driven him to accept Bowie's challenge had evolved into a deeper understanding of artistic vulnerability and mutual respect. His approach to music would never be quite the same again, forever influenced by the lessons he had learned about the power of restraint and the beauty of creative space. The Persian-born showman had discovered that sometimes the most powerful performances came not from dominating every moment, but from knowing when to step back and allow the music itself to speak. Bowie's own evolution was equally significant, though characteristically more subtle in its expression. The collaboration had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a willingness to surrender complete control and trust in the creative process. His calculated coolness had given way to genuine emotional investment, and the results were audible in every note he played. The Thin White Duke had rediscovered the joy of musical surprise, the thrill of not knowing exactly where a song would lead until it arrived at its destination. The other members of Queen had also been fundamentally changed by the experience. John Deacon's bass line would become one of the most recognizable and influential in rock history, studied and emulated by countless musicians. Roger Taylor's drumming had reached new heights of sophistication, while Brian May's guitar work had expanded into territories he had never explored before. Each member had been pushed beyond their comfort zones and had emerged as better musicians for the experience. As the final mixes were completed and the master tapes were carefully stored, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The challenge that had brought Freddie and Bowie together had resulted in more than just a successful collaboration. It had created a piece of music that would transcend genres, generations, and cultural boundaries. The song's eventual release would confirm what everyone in that Swiss studio already knew. They had created something timeless. Under Pressure would go on to influence countless artists, from hip-hop producers who would sample its iconic bass line to rock bands who would study its perfect balance of accessibility and sophistication. The track would become a testament to the power of artistic collaboration, proving that when true masters are willing to challenge each other and surrender their egos for the sake of the music, the results can be genuinely magical. Years later, both Freddie and Bowie would speak of this collaboration as one of the defining moments of their careers. The challenge that had seemed so daunting at the beginning had become a gift, an opportunity to push beyond their individual limitations and create something that neither could have achieved alone. The legacy of those days at Mountain Studios would endure long after both artists had left this world, a permanent reminder that the greatest art emerges when creative giants dare to trust each other completely. The challenge had been met, exceeded, and transformed into something eternal. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional and inspiring tales about Freddie's life and legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and often your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.